Is the Head of Responsible Investment at Scottish Widows. And we're talking today about reclaiming the purpose of markets. And for me, the most important word on that is reclaim. I think that the word reclaim is a really strong and important word. And before we jump into the questions we have, Eva, I'm going to put you on the spot and ask if you wanted to reply to some of the thoughts John had in that keynote. I know you weren't prepped for that, but I feel like you were nodding along a lot. So.
I was nodding along to John and also to David, actually. A lot of the things that, when we think about the essays that we wrote for the publication that's coming out today, were around justice within markets and the importance of thinking about externalities, which is pretty much what Sir John was talking about, with how water and some of the externalities around not managing things properly can ultimately have those downstream impacts that Sir John was talking about. We'll come to the questions, and it's been really, really great to contribute to the publication and think about Adam Smith through these kind of justice lenses and morality and externalities. And so, yeah.
Okay, well, shall we come straight to your first question then, which is from the perspective of a long-term, so you're a long-term asset owner. How does climate change fundamentally challenge the assumption that markets will allocate capital efficiently?
I mean, this is a fundamental question for asset owners who are investing, as you said, for the long term, but also many asset owners invest in markets, often in indices. We heard from Stephanie earlier about indices, and can't diversify away from risks like climate change. When we look at the materiality of climate change risks, but also the opportunities, they underpin ultimately the return, or can damage significantly the return we can expect from financial markets. And one of the things I explored in the essay, which was about, some of you might have seen this on my LinkedIn post, a stern look at Smith through the eyes of an asset owner. And that was bringing my own experience of an economic student at the time when the Stern Review came out, and saying that climate change is the greatest and widest ranging market failure ever seen. And so what that means is markets do not allocate capital efficiently, and that the damage caused by climate change and those emitting carbon is felt by others that are then paying for it. And that clearly is, when we go back to what we heard about justice and Adam Smith, violating the laws of justice, and therefore ultimately, fundamental for asset owners to understand how these kind of externalities and market failures, what impact they have on long-term returns, and how that can be tackled more effectively, and what these market failures often do need intervention from wider parties, policymakers, but also I think asset owners have a role to help influence and address them.
So your point there was that markets don't allocate efficiently and violate the laws of justice. Isn't that kind of a terrifying idea? That this thing that we're relying on, that we expect to at least be form part of society and creating a relatively fair society, doesn't achieve that. So John, did you want to comment on that idea? And if you do, you need to just hold it.
Hello, can you hear me on this?
Yes.
Yeah. Right. Okay, so that goes straight back to what David was saying earlier. And it's about how people who operate in markets actually think and behave. And that is about, do they have concepts of justice and the like in what they do? If some of you pick up the book which has been advertised, although curiously advertised, because I know doesn't appear to be for sale. Anyway, I strongly recommend that you obtain it if you have the opportunity to buy it, and I particularly strongly recommend that you read my piece of it. Some of the others are very good as well. But what I do in that is I talk about the quote we've already heard this morning, I think from David, but not from benevolence, quote from Smith, which is so widely used, particularly by people who have not read anything else that he wrote beyond that particular phrase. because, as he explains very well, it is not simply from benevolence that we expect our dinner. It is from a great many other things. And I reproduce in that that volume conversation between Mrs. Smith, who actually was Smith's mother, who managed his household affairs, and the butcher, in which he obtains, thanks to the algorithms which good butchers used then, as they do now, to decide which of their customers will be appropriate recipients of his, not benevolence, but largesse or transactions, decide which customers will get what they should be doing. The point there is that the relationship between Mrs. Smith and Mrs. Smith's butcher was both a social and a commercial relationship. And this is the point David made at some length, and we need to repeat often and often. Successful relationships in a market economy are both social and transactional, and one without the other typically does not succeed in producing the outputs we all want.
Can I segue perfectly there for Eva? And this is an ideal time to talk about stewardship, because I think that that's a key issue there. And what does meaningful stewardship look like? And I encourage you to be really, I want to say honest, I'm not implying you lie. But, I mean, we've all heard what stewardship is, but what does it look like on the ground?
I think what we're seeing and what more meaningful stewardship, and by that really influencing and shaping best practice, and making sure that you have a voice in addressing some of these market failures or risks that we really see as financial, is that you look at systems level. We've heard that before earlier today, but for a long time, engagement or stewardship, as an asset owner, we work through our asset managers, and I was on the asset management side for many years. It focuses a lot on individual companies and often on identifying, leaders, laggards, and engaging with companies. And those companies operate within systems that, where they face certain barriers, certain incentives, going back to the market failures, that they won't just be able to address or overcome individually. So that firstly collective stewardship and engagement, so that asset owners like ourselves get together and have a joint view on what good looks like. One of the examples we did together with Brunel and the People's Pension was this climate stewardship expectation statement that many asset owners have since signed up to, setting very clear principles-based expectations of our asset managers in terms of how they engage not only with companies but with policymakers, with wider industry, the resourcing they have, and how they clearly demonstrate stewardship priorities. So I think that joined up collective setting of priorities and a strong voice from asset owners, and the importance of looking, as I said, at the incentives and barriers within the system the companies operate in, and then really looking at all the different players in that system. Policymakers, standard setters, regulators, we heard about the importance of that in the water industry as well, is really, really critical that we go to that level.
No, can I make a point?
You can. Before you do, John, I'm going to be coming to questions soon, so start thinking about them and start grabbing my eye. John.
Right. I'd like, and I have no hope of success in this, to persuade people to stop using the word ownership. Eva has been talking about asset ownership. I don't think in any interesting sense Scottish widows are asset owners. I talked about Thames Water, and there's a lot of talk there about public ownership. I don't know who owns the sewers of London are. I think the question of who owns the sewers of London, which have been around in one form or another for several hundred years now, I don't think the question of who owns it is an interesting one, or one that has any sensible answer. This is not about public ownership. I went on an uncomfortable train the other day, and I asked myself, who owns the train I'm travelling on? The answer, if it helps you, and I don't think it does, is it's operated by LMER, which is a government-owned company. The train is owned by a company called Agility Trains. If you ask who Agility Trains are, the answer is they are a company owned partly by Hitachi, by AXA, the insurance company, and partly by GLIL. If you don't know either who GLIL is, the answer is it is a consortium of local authority pension funds. However, Agility Trains has contracts with LMER, with the Department for Transport, and so on. This is simply not a very interesting story to...
And yet you're telling us.
Quite. And what is more interesting, and very difficult to get an answer to, is the question of who will make my journey more comfortable than it actually was travelling in this Agility train. We need to be talking about systems of control and a lot less about ownership. And that's my response to what Eva was saying about what Scottish Widows and other people in this room need to be doing. It's about stewardship. What people in this room and Scottish Widows and a load of other people should have done was kicked out the management of Thames Water quite a long time ago. And that's their job looking forward. And the question of who, in some theoretical sense, owns Thames Water or the assets that Thames Water deploys is not very interesting or very important.
I heard a story through a story. I'm trying to extract myself from any legal liability here. Of someone who said, oh yeah, Thames Water, yeah, well, we'll just write that off. Because for them, it was about a line in the balance sheet, not about the operating of a company and actually the health of humans, human health as well, if not planetary health. Did you want to come back to that, Eva, before we go to questions?
Yeah, I mean, whether we call it ownership or something else, actually somebody has previously said a similar thing to me. You don't actually own the assets, it's your members, your beneficiaries, and of course I guess the capital that we allocate to invest. So it's a long value chain, I would say, from the end person that will invest in their workplace pension or invest directly to then asset owners, as they are called today in the industry, allocating and making those decisions. I think what's important though is to recognise the influence and role that therefore large pension funds, investors, asset owners have in the industry in then working with their asset managers and writing things into mandates and engaging with, let's say, policymakers. I think that's really important, whether we call it ownership or something else.
It's a good, I mean, and again, we like disagreement in this room, we want it, but what we're coming to here is a common ground, which is about stewardship and about actual influence. We have a question. Excellent. Just keep talking, it'll come to you.
If I keep talking like this?
Yes.
Okay, now I hear it. Okay. Hi, Stuart Moncrief from Triodos Bank, and thank you for the discussion. And maybe just to build on what Eve is talking about, I think traditionally companies taking big risks would pay the price of that risk by becoming bankrupt or failing. And maybe in a healthy market, we allow them to fail because it can absorb that. When we talk about climate risk, what strikes me is a lot of the climate risk that we're doing now, companies that are factoring it in are often adding costs onto what they're doing. And if companies are taking big climate risks and they're not factoring it in, while they might be making sort of short-term financial gains, I think the risks are paid for by wider society and other businesses. So with that, how should the market be adjusted in order to price in that climate risk or force the market to price in that climate risk effectively?
Yeah, I've got a couple of views on that. One being, obviously, there is carbon pricing in some regions, and that tries to tackle or put a price on those that aren't reducing their emissions. I do actually in my essay talk about the fact that 28% of global carbon emissions currently have a carbon price. So that is, clearly still insufficient to have that policy incentive to price climate change. But what we're also seeing is climate change scenario analysis, risk analysis, to actually look at different climate scenarios and what financial impact they have on portfolios and companies today. That's something I was extensively involved in my previous role at Aberdeen, and you can actually then look at what is expected in terms of a financial impact and build this into your strategic asset allocation, into your stock selection, index construction, etc. So there have to be certain mechanisms to be able to reflect that financially, but obviously there's also a huge uncertainty of the future, of the policy environment, of the technology that will drive the transition, and what ultimately financially that means for individual companies. But absolutely agree that risks that are financially material, we have to figure out how that is actually reflected in the financials.
Sasha, question.
Thank you. Does it work?
Yeah.
Yep. So John, thank you very much. Very interesting tale about the London water. Now, in this particular case, the cost is socialized, the profit is privatized. That's how the system works. You talk about stewardship and duty, pretty much. But how is that, what do you think we need to do on a legal level to change this? Because the issue of fiduciary duty is a big one here, especially in the case that you are describing. So how do we sort of socialize profits and privatize cost? What's the sort of the game here that we need to change? Thank you.
I think, to be honest, fiduciary duty is another phrase I would prefer to do without in this. It is very clear what the duty of the Thames Water Board was to promote the success of the company. That's what English law says. And it's very clear that whatever you might think the Board of Thames Water did, they did not promote the success of the company. The company would not be in the state it is in if they had promoted the success of it. I think that's a description of English law. And I think it's quite important in this discussion that we should understand that law in different countries in terms of directors' duties differs from country to country. In the United States, we're basically talking about Delaware law, and Delaware law purports to be shareholder friendly, while in reality being executive friendly, because US states are engaged in competition with each other to attract corporate registrations. I could give quite a long lecture on that issue and don't intend to, but there might be another occasion on which some of you would wish to hear it. German law is quite strange because it's not quite strange. It's very straightforward. There is essentially a constitution which says that property must be used for the common good. And there is a civil code which governs the management of companies, which provides a list of the things that the board of a company must consider in managing that company. That's nearly what English law says, but it isn't quite, because it refers to promoting the success of the company for the benefit of shareholders as a whole, which is pretty clear. But then it produces a list of things that the board should have regard to in doing that. That's actually a 2006 compromise between people who took a very narrow view of the purposes of the company and took a very wider view, and probably, as was intended, there has been no litigation, as you might have mentioned, on how these possible contradictions are to be resolved.
Can I ask John on that, if the Thames, and without wanting to go too deep into the Thames Water case study, although we are already in it, if the purpose was to promote the success of the company, and it's not a surprise to us that this has happened recently, everyone has seen that Thames Water was heading in this direction, why was there no recourse earlier when it was obvious that the shareholders were extracting the value?
Well, there are two groups of people who might have taken action. One was the regulator, which worked relatively well in the early days of water privatisation and had become pretty ineffective halfway through. It's perfectly obvious, I think, that in the years after 2000, the regulator should not have allowed successive transfers of control of that and other water companies which occurred. It's also, I think, something in which asset managers should have taken a larger role. They allowed the shareholdings of Thames Water to be passed from a quite widely dispersed structure which took place immediately after privatisation to the focused and mostly foreign-owned structure which was in place in the 21st century. And I think the duty of proper stewards of British assets is to resist that. And that's a duty which a lot of people in this room need to be much more active about engaging in. We need stewards to be more effective supervisors of corporate management than they have been in recent years.
And I would argue not when it gets to the extreme, but before that. Yeah. Yes. Question here.
Yeah, Simon Perham, Carbon Tracker. I want to change tack a little bit and ask the panel, do they think that GDP is a suitable metric for climate damage? And if there is a better metric available, would that focus the minds of markets more suitably?
Lovely direct question. Eva.
I mean, I don't think GDP is a suitable metric that captures climate damage or societal well-being or, you know, many other things that reflect ultimately that, you know, it reflects clearly the economic growth, but how that growth is distributed and what some of the impacts are on the planet, ecological impact, clearly not. I don't know if I've got an answer to what would be a better metric and alternative, but I think we need to look beyond just GDP. And one of the things that I think links to that I was going to highlight, we spoke about the Stern review, is the more recent book Stern published last year was positioning climate action as the growth story of the 21st century. So actually expanding a view on just growth and growth that drives, you know, that is sustainable, resilient, more inclusive, and how we better capture that is a core message and core concept of what sometimes is referred to as the Stern Review 2.0 from last year, and that is a much better way of looking at it. So I do think we need to enhance our thinking on that.
John, as some wrap-up comments, John.
Right. No, of course GDP is an appropriate metric. That's not what GDP was intended for and the purpose it serves. What is a good metric? As someone who's spent their life calculating and dealing with numbers, I want to resist people trying to find metrics of more or less everything. You can't and you don't. This is back to what we were saying about pluralism and value pluralism and the like. There are many ways of measuring success in all areas of life, from our day-to-day behavior to the performance of our businesses. And the notion that these can be aggregated into some single metric, which we ought to be trying to maximize, is not the way the world either should work or does work.
It harks me back to GEFI about 3 or 4 years ago when I was running a panel about metrics. And those who remember know my view on measurement and metrics. And the title of the panel was "Forgive Me, Father, for I Have Measured." And it was this sense in which we need to think carefully about what we're measuring and why. And we need to do that after we've decided what matters, not before. Thank you so much to the panel. Please join me in thanking them.